The following lesson is linked to Learning Outcome 2, Reading and Viewing, and addresses the assessment standard that requires learners to explain the writer's and/or the character's viewpoint and give supporting evidence from the text. Hello and welcome to the next lesson in the series on short stories. Today we're looking specifically at language, speech and dialogue. Short stories are just like cake. It is true that they are wonderful when they're finished and they're all ready for you to enjoy. When we read a short story, it's just like tasting a bit of cake. We just experience a finished product. We don't always think about the ingredients that go into it. Just like a cake is the yummy combination of lots of separate elements that aren't very interesting when they're by themselves. In the same way, stories are made out of words, but until they are lovingly combined and arranged by the author, they mean nothing. Today we'll be looking at language and how Ken Themba uses language to create the unique and interesting story that is The Suit. Of course, the language that has been used in the short story that you're studying won't be the same as the language in The Suit. But this lesson will equip you with the tools you need to discuss the language used in literature and the effects that this creates. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to define direct speech and dialogue, discuss how the use of language contributes to the impact of a story. Now, language is a very wide area for us to look at, so let's break it down into specific aspects of language. First, there is register. This is a term that you have seen before, but let's get reacquainted. Register refers to the type of language that is appropriate for use in a certain situation. Before you watch the rest of this lesson, write down some notes or discuss with a partner how you would describe the register of The Suit. Is it formal or informal? And also think about what effects you think have been created by the language that has been used. In a story, the author uses language that he feels will be effective in conveying character, theme, or atmosphere. The Suit is a story about a man's everyday life. It is about the little details of getting dressed, going to the toilet, having breakfast, and going to work. But even though the content is simple, Ken Themba chooses some pretty tricky vocabulary to describe these simple details. Let's pick out a few features of the language that Ken Themba uses or has used to tell his story.
5:30 in the morning, and the candlewick bedspread frowned as the man under it stirred. He did not like to wake his wife lying by his side, as yet, so he crawled up and out by careful peristalsis. But before he tiptoed out of his room with shoes and socks under his arm, he leaned over and peered at the sleeping serenity of his wife. To him, a daily matutinal miracle.
Wow, this is the first paragraph and already the author has got us reaching for our dictionaries. He uses a word like peristalsis instead of creeping. The only time I've ever seen the word peristalsis being used is in a biology textbook to describe food moving through the gut. He could have said stillness instead of serenity. And I had no idea that matutinal meant happens every day. Until I looked it up. Now we could just assume that Ken Themba is showing off the fact that he knows a lot of big words, or we can look at the language as one of the ingredients that he had to add to the flavor of the story. These fancy words do two things. Firstly, they make a contrast between the humble, simple physical world of Philemon and the words used to describe him and his life. Secondly, the language gives us insight into his character. He is an intelligent, well-read, educated man who uses this very fancy vocabulary very naturally. Ken Themba has used very formal language, and he has reasons for doing this. But as you read other short stories, you will notice that a wide range of registers are used. What other types of languages are there? Let's add these ideas to our mind map for short stories so that no matter what short story you are studying, you will be aware of the type of language that has been used. When we consider the language used in a short story, we must think about the register and vocabulary. Language can be poetic or simple, full of slang or jargon, emotive or objective, and finally, speech and dialogue. We've already said that on the whole, the language used in The Suit is formal, but can you think of any examples in the story The Suit where different types of language have been used? What impact has the language had? We see a good example of poetic language in the section of the text after Philemon hears about Matilda's affair.
It was not quite like the explosion of a devastating bomb. It was more like the critical breakdown in an infinitely delicate mechanism. From outside, the machine seemed to have gone dead, but deep down in its innermost recesses, menacing electrical flashes were leaping from coil to coil, and hot, viscous molten metal was creeping upon the fuel tanks.
In this paragraph, the author uses figurative language to tell the reader about Philemon's internal conflict. This entire paragraph is one quite complicated metaphor, comparing Philemon's heartbreak to a piece of machinery that is collapsing. Of course, identifying the type of language that has been used is usually only part of the problem solved. As you study short stories in class, you will notice that you are often required not only to identify the language that has been used, but also comment on the effect that it has been created by it. So what effect has this poetic language created? Well, its poetic nature makes it easier for us to imagine how Philemon feels. We can visualize a machine that seems fine from the outside, but simply isn't working anymore. If we look at the language that has been used in a short story, we can also check to see if the story is objective or emotive. To illustrate what I mean, let's take a passage and highlight the descriptive words so that we can decide if we're just being given the facts or if some bias is creeping. Matilda, he barked. Our visitor. The sheer savagery with which he cracked at her jerked her up, but only when she saw the brute cruelty in his face did she run out of the room, toppling the chair behind her. Let's underline the descriptive words in this paragraph. Barked, sheer savagery, cracked, brute cruelty, and lastly, toppling. If this paragraph had been written in objective style, it would sound like a police report. It would have very little subjective emotion. It would look more like this. Matilda, he said, our visitor. The way he spoke to her made her jump, and when she saw the look on his face, she ran out of the room, knocking over the chair behind her. From this exercise, we can definitely see that Kantamba's style of language is definitely not objective. Instead, it is descriptive and emotive. He wants us to imagine the scene as being dramatic, and the emotive words that he has used help us to do this. Another way in which the author uses language to set the scene or describe what is happening is by using the direct speech to give the exact words that come out of a character's mouth. Direct speech refers to when the actual words used by the person are recorded between inverted commas. To get some inside information on the way that dialogue and speech works in a short story, we went to talk to someone who would really know.
A story without direct speech is a dead story. Direct speech is what brings something alive, and that's where you can bring your character to life. Direct speech tells you about a character, the kind of language they use, the slang that they use, the way they speak to each other, whether they're very abrupt, whether they talk in a certain way, and the way they relate to each other. Indirect speech is for when you can say something better and quicker through your own words.
It is possible to write a story without any direct speech at all, but authors usually use at least some direct speech. When characters speak to other characters, this is dialogue. The use of dialogue makes the characters seem more real. Dialogue is a conversation between two or more people. It is a useful way of developing characters and creating good narrative. Let us sum up some of the uses of direct speech in a short story. Direct speech makes a change from narrative, gives a sense of everyday experience, reveals character by the words they use, reveals character by the tone, attitudes, and expressions in their speech. Let us look at dialogue in The Suit. This is a very little dialogue in this short story. Most of the information we get about the characters comes from what the narrator tells us. We'll study the narrator in more detail in later lessons. The character who gets to speak the most is Philemon, which is normal since he's the protagonist or main character. We can tell quite a lot about the relationship that he has with Mr. Mapikela from the dialogue at the bus terminus.
"Son," he said sadly, "if I could have avoided this, believe you me, I would. But my wife is nagging the spice out of my life for not talking to you about it." It did not become all blistering Mapikela to sound so grave, and Philemon took compassion on him. "Go ahead, Dad," he said generously. "You can talk to me about anything." The old man gave a pathetic smile. "Well, it's not really any of our business. My wife felt, you see, damn it all. I wish these women would not snoop around so much." Then he rushed with it. "Anyway, it seems there's a young man who's going to visit your wife every morning for these last blooming 3 months. And that wife of mine swears by heathen gods you don't know a thing about it." Philemon heard gears grinding and screaming in his head. "Dad," he said hoarsely, "I have to back home." He turned round and did not hear Mapikela's anxious, "Steady, son, steady, son."
What were you able to tell about these two characters and their relationship from this dialogue? Jot down your ideas. First of all, the two men call each other son and dad, showing us the closeness of their relationship. In this section of the dialogue, we see the way it is written. There are dots showing pauses, and the sentences don't really make sense. Mr. Mapikela stops, and then starts, and then swears and eventually rushes the words out. This tells us that the old man is uncomfortable about telling Philemon and is trying to avoid saying the words. It gives us insight that Mr. Mapikela cares about Philemon. We also understand that this is going to be very hurtful news for Philemon to hear. What is unusual is how little dialogue Matilda has. She's the only other main character in the story, and yet she only speaks 3 times. Once when Philemon leaves for work, "Off with you," she scolded him on his way. Once when she asked to join the Married Women's Club. "Phil, I'd like to join one of those cultural clubs for married women. Would you mind?" And finally at the party when she begs Philemon not to make her serve the suit in front of the guests. "Just this once, Phil." In this story, Matilda doesn't say enough for us to get information about her character from her words. Instead, we understand something about her character because of her silence. The reader sees that the tension in their marriage has become so bad that they are hardly talking to each other. Philemon only speaks to his wife when he's telling her what to do or when they are talking about the suit. In other words, the silence between them is actually a form of dialogue, and it gives us information about the couple's relationship. I hope that this lesson has convinced you that the words an author uses are not chosen at random. The register and style and the use of direct speech all help to set the scene and create characters. If you can identify the type of language that has been used in literature, and if you can comment on the effect that it has created, as we have done today, then you will be well on your way to analyzing short stories effectively. To see if you can do these things, it is time for today's task. "Matilda," he shouted, "get our visitor." Then with incisive sarcasm, "Or are you ashamed of him?" She went ash grey, but there was nothing for it but to fetch her albatross. What is an albatross? Why do you think Cantemba has used this word to describe the suit? The choices that an author makes when it comes to the language used in a story gives the actions and plot their particular flavor. Any story can be told in a number of different ways, but language creates a specific effect. The words that characters speak and the way in which they speak can give us information about the character, relationships, atmosphere, and environment. That's it for today's lesson. Join me next time when we'll look at mood and atmosphere in more detail. Goodbye.